The courtroom smelled like old wood and new fear. A girl stood behind the witness stand, 18 years old. Scars across both palms, still pink, still raised, the kind that come from grabbing something you were never meant to hold on to. Her clothes were clean but borrowed. Her shoes didn't match her belt. Her hair was pulled back tight, the way someone does it when they want nothing loose, nothing that can be grabbed, nothing that suggests softness. And her eyes, steady as a rifle sight, were locked on a man sitting 12 feet away in a $3,000 suit. Judge Preston Mercer, retired, respected, connected to every courthouse in Northeast Florida. Silver hair combed back with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years making sure nothing about him was ever out of place. His hands were folded on the defense table, the fingers interlaced perfectly still. The kind of stillness that comes from decades of practice of sitting on a bench and watching other people's lives come apart while maintaining an expression that communicated authority and impartiality and absolutely nothing else. He did not look at the girl. He had not looked at her since she entered the room. That was deliberate. She recognized it. She had seen that technique before in shelters and group homes, in every room where an adult with power had decided that a child was not worth acknowledging. The refusal to see was its own kind of violence. But she was done being unseen. The bailiff asked her to state her name. She leaned toward the microphone. The courtroom waited. Cut to black, 6 months earlier. The highway along the St. Johns River stretched thin and dark, a two-lane corridor carved between pine forest and black water. No streetlights for the last 4 miles. No guardrails worth trusting. Just the low hum of tires on cracked asphalt and the river running alongside, swollen from 3 days of rain, moving faster than it looked. Garrison Boone drove with both hands on the wheel, knuckles pale against the leather. Most people who knew him called him Gar. The men who rode with him called him President. He had held the chair of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, Florida, chapter for 11 years. He was 45 years old, 214 pounds, and right now he was trying very hard to keep his breathing even. The meeting had gone wrong, not the kind of wrong you can fix with a handshake or a second round of drinks, the kind of wrong that sits behind your eyes and presses outward, a dull spreading ache that won't let you think about anything else. Words had been said in that clubhouse tonight that could not be unsaid. Lines had been drawn that could not be undrawn. And as Gar replayed the conversation for the third time in his mind, he kept arriving at the same conclusion. Those men were not going to let it go. He told himself he just needed to get home. 20 more minutes, lock the door, sit in the dark with a glass of something strong, and figure out what came next. 20 minutes. That was all. He never got those 20 minutes. The headlights appeared in his mirror first. High beams too close, closing fast. A black pickup, no plates visible, riding the center line like it owned both lanes. Gar adjusted his grip and eased right, giving room. The truck didn't pass. It surged forward and cut hard into his lane. No signal, no hesitation, just a sudden violent swerve that stole the road out from under him. Gar yanked the wheel. Tires screamed against wet pavement. For half a second, the world stretched thin, that impossible moment where physics hasn't decided yet, where everything is still recoverable, where the brain is already running the math, but the hands haven't caught up. Then the math came back wrong. Metal hit the guardrail with a crack that split the night open. Not a crunch, not a scrape. A crack. The sound of something structural failing at the molecular level, a sound that Gar would hear in his sleep for months afterward, sharp as a rifle shot, and final as a period at the end of a sentence. The barrier folded, not bent. Folded, like cardboard left out in the rain. 40 feet of galvanized steel that was supposed to stop a 4,000-pound vehicle at highway speed simply gave way, the weakened bolts shearing clean the pre-cut sections, separating along the lines that had been scored into them hours earlier by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The front end pitched forward, and the car went over the embankment nose first airborne for 1 full second. In that second time did something strange. It expanded. Gar saw the river rushing up toward the windshield with perfect clarity. He saw the surface of the water black and textured with current, reflecting nothing, absorbing everything. He saw his own hands still gripping the steering wheel. He had time to think one complete thought. This is what they meant. Then the river caught him. The impact was brutal, not the sharp instant impact of hitting something solid. This was different. This was heavy. The water didn't push back so much as pulled down, swallowing the car like a throat closing around something it intended to keep. Water exploded upwards, swallowing the windshield in a single white flash. Gar's forehead slammed into the steering column. Something warm ran down into his left eye. Sound collapsed. The world became a dull, pressurized roar underwater and inescapable, as if the river had reached inside the car and pressed its hands over his ears. Water poured in through every seam. It came up his legs, first shockingly cold, then his waist, then his chest, each inch stealing heat and air in time. He reached for the door handle. Pulled. Nothing. The guardrail had crushed the frame on impact, bending the door into the body of the car like a fist closing around a piece of paper. The metal had welded itself shut. He shoved harder. Both hands, shoulder braced. The door did not move. The water reached his chin. His headlights were still on, flickering weakly beneath the surface, casting distorted beams through the murk. Bubbles tore past his face in frantic streams. Each breath burned shorter than the last. His lungs felt like they were being squeezed by something enormous and patient. And then the realization settled over him, heavier than the water. This was how it ended. Not on the road, not in a fight, not in any of the ways he had imagined over 11 years of leading men who lived outside the lines. It ended here in the dark, in the cold alone, in a river that didn't know his name and didn't care. Above the surface, shapes gathered on the road. A woman in a sedan had seen the car go over. She pulled to the shoulder and called 911. A man in a work truck stopped behind her. Then another car. Then two more. Then a run. Within 90 seconds, nearly 20 people stood along the broken guardrail, looking down at the sinking vehicle. Someone shouted. Someone else held up a phone, the flashlight cutting a thin white beam across the black water. A few voices called out instructions. Nobody followed. The current was too strong, the water too cold, the bank too steep. One man took 3 steps down the embankment, felt his boots slide in the mud, and climbed back up. 20 people, 40 hands. Not one of them reached the water. Inside the car, Gar's thoughts began to scatter. He thought about the clubhouse, about the men waiting for him to come back and tell them what to do next, about conversations he had never finished, promises he had made to people who trusted him. He thought about his son, dead 10 years now, a motorcycle accident on a clear Sunday morning, 22 years old, gone before the ambulance arrived. He thought about how the river felt the same way grief did, cold, rising, patient. His mouth slipped below the waterline. He tilted his head back, found one last pocket of air against the roof, and held it. 3 inches of air, maybe 4. The car groaned and shifted, settling deeper into the riverbed. The headlights flickered once more and went dark. Nobody on that road knew what was really happening. Nobody understood that this crash was not an accident, that the guardrail had been cut hours before Gar ever touched the highway, that someone had known exactly where he would be, exactly when, and exactly how much damage it would take to send him into the water. But we'll get to that. First, you need to meet the girl who saved his life. Wren Calloway had been asleep beneath the bridge when the sound tore through the night. A sharp crack of metal followed by a hollow, echoing boom that rattled the concrete above her head like a drum skin. She sat up instantly, hard-hammering hands already pulling the thin blanket off her legs before her eyes were fully open. You learn to wake fast when you live outside. Sleep is never deep. It is a shallow, fragile thing. One ear always turned toward the world, one hand always close to your shoes, because shoes are the first things someone will take from you. She was 18 years old. She had been homeless for 8 months. Before that, she had been a lot of things. A daughter, a student, a girl with a bedroom that had a lock on the door and a window that looked out onto a street where nothing ever happened. That was Jacksonville. That was before. Her mother's name was Ruth. She had worked 2 jobs for as long as Wren could remember. Day shift at a dry cleaner's on Edgewood Avenue. Night shift stocking shelves at a grocery store on the south side. Ruth Calloway was the kind of woman who never sat down during dinner because she was always getting up to get something for someone else. She laughed easily. She worried quietly. She kept a jar of coins on top of the refrigerator that she called the Someday Fund, though she never said what someday was for. The diagnosis came in March. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors used words like aggressive and palliative and comfortable words that sounded gentle, but meant there was nothing left to do. Ruth spent 11 weeks in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and wilted flowers. Wren went every day after school. She did her homework on the floor beside the bed. She held her mother's hand while machines beeped in patterns. She learned to read the steady ones that meant things were holding the irregular ones that meant they weren't. Ruth died on a Tuesday afternoon. The room was quiet. The machines had been turned off an hour before. Wren was holding her hand when it happened, and she knew the exact moment because her mother's grip, which had been loose and warm, went still. Not cold, just still, like a clock stopping. After that, the system took over. Foster care. A group home in Orange Park where the ceiling leaked and the older kids ran things in ways the staff pretended not to see. Then a shelter downtown where a man with clean fingernails and a calm voice started asking questions that felt wrong, questions about where she wanted to go, about whether she had family, about whether anyone would notice if she left. She didn't answer those questions. She left the shelter instead. She would learn later how close she had come to disappearing entirely. But that night, all she knew was that the man's questions had made the hair on her arms stand up, and she had learned to trust that feeling. 8 months under bridges behind strip malls and the doorways of closed churches. She carried everything she owned in a backpack with one working zipper. 2 shirts, a toothbrush, a pocket knife with a chipped blade she had found in a parking lot, and a wristwatch with a cracked face and a dead battery on the last thing her mother had worn before the hospital took it off her arm and put it in a plastic bag. The watch hadn't worked in over a year. Wren wore it every day. She crawled out from under the bridge and looked toward the road. Through the trees, she could see taillights scattered along the highway shoulder their red glow flickering through the branches like something burning. Voices carried down the embankment, muffled by distance and the sound of the river. Then she saw the headlights, 2 weak beams beneath the surface of the water, wobbling and distorted like eyes trying to stay open. A car was in the river, and it was sinking. For 1 second, she stood still. The cold pressed against her skin through a jacket 2 sizes too big, found at a donation bin outside a Methodist church 3 months ago. Her shoes were worn flat at the soles, the laces mismatched, one black, one gray. Her hands were already rough from sleeping on concrete, the knuckles dry and split. She looked up at the road. 20 people stood along the broken guardrail, phone screens, glowing voices rising, but bodies locked in place. Nobody was moving toward the water. She ran, not toward the road, toward the river. Her feet slapped against wet gravel, then mud, then the soft, sucking clay of the riverbank. She could hear voices above her, distant and useless people shouting, things like, "Somebody call 911, and is there a rope?" And oh my God, but the voices stayed where they were, and so did the people attached to them. She hit the water at full speed, and the cold ripped the breath from her chest like a hand reaching inside her ribs. The shock was total, absolute. Every nerve in her body fired at once, a white-hot scream that her brain translated as, "Stop, turn back, this will kill you." Her legs seized, her vision flashed white. The current slammed into her knees, then her thighs pulling sideways with a force that had no interest in negotiation. She stumbled, went down on one knee, felt the river try to fold her flat, and came back up, swinging her arms for balance. She kept going. The water climbed. Waist, chest. Each step was a war. The riverbed beneath her was uneven, littered with rocks and branches, and the soft, treacherous pockets of mud that grabbed at her feet and wouldn't let go. Her shoes filled and became anchors. Her jacket soaked through and doubled in weight, pulling at her shoulders, turning every movement into an act of brute will. The cold went from sharp to deep to something beyond sensation entirely, a kind of numbness that didn't feel like numbness at all, but like the slow, patient removal of her body from her control. Every instinct she had, every survival reflex built over 8 months of sleeping in the open, of learning which doorways were safe and which footsteps meant danger, told her to stop. The water was too cold, the current too strong. She was 118 pounds soaking wet. She had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. The math did not work. The math had never worked in her favor, not once in 18 years. She didn't stop. The car sat crooked against the broken guardrail, posts tilted forward at a steep angle, the front end already fully submerged. Water lapped at the rear window. The driver's side window was dark, the interior lit only by the faint green glow of the dashboard clock, still running. still counting time inside a car that was running out of it. She reached the window and pressed her face close to the glass, her breath fogging it instantly. A man was inside. Big. Slumped against the steering column, blood streaked across his forehead in a dark line. His eyes were half open, unfocused, fluttering the way eyes do when the body is giving up, but the brain hasn't agreed yet. Bubbles slipped from his mouth, slow and uneven. She pounded on the glass. Her voice came out in a ragged shout that the river swallowed whole. She grabbed the door handle and pulled. Nothing. The metal frame was crushed tight, sealed by the impact with the guardrail. She pulled again, harder, both hands wrapped around the handle of feet bracing against the riverbed. Her muscles screamed. The door didn't move. Panic came, hot and sharp, flooding her chest, tightening her throat. She could feel it trying to take over, trying to shut down the part of her brain that was still thinking. She shoved it down. Somewhere inside her, beneath the cold and the fear and the 8 months of being invisible, a thought cut through the noise. Nobody helped me when I needed it. I am not walking away from this. She planted her feet against the bent guardrail post, bracing her back against the side of the car. She wrapped both hands around the door handle, adjusted her grip, felt skin tear against cold metal. And she pulled. Everything she had, every ounce of strength left in a body that hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. Arms shaking, back arching, teeth clenched so hard her jaw popped. The river dragged at her, trying to rip her loose, and she held on. The door groaned, a deep metallic sound like something breaking that was never supposed to break. The seal between the crushed frame and the door cracked. Water rushed in harder through the gap, but the door moved. 1 inch, 2, 3. She wedged her shoulder into the opening and forced it wider. Inside, the water was at the man's chin. His eyes had closed. She reached in, wrapped her arms around his chest and pulled. 200 pounds of dead weight, soaking wet, unconscious. She dragged him through the opening, the jagged metal catching on his jacket, tearing fabric, scraping across her forearms. She stumbled backward, lost her footing, went under for one terrible second, and came back up, gasping with his weight still in her arms. Step by agonizing step. The current fought her for every inch. Her lungs burned, her legs shook. The cold had gone from painful to numb to something beyond numb, a distant ringing absence where feeling used to be. She held on. By the time she reached the bank, she couldn't feel her hands. She dragged him up the slope through mud and dead grass and collapsed to her knees beside him. He coughed, a violent wrenching sound. Water poured from his mouth. His chest heaved. Air tore back into his lungs in ragged, desperate gulps. He was alive. Above them, the road erupted. People rushed down the embankment now that the danger was over, now that someone else had done the impossible thing. Hands grabbed at the man's shoulders. Voices shouted for towels, for blankets, for someone to flag down the ambulances. They could already hear screaming in the distance. Nobody grabbed Wren. Nobody even looked at her. She was a shape in the dark, at the edge of the frame, wet and small, and already fading into the background, like she had never been part of the picture at all. She sat on the riverbank for a moment, breathing hard, water streaming from her closed hands, bleeding from a dozen small cuts she couldn't feel. The adrenaline was still running, but she could feel it starting to ebb like a tide pulling back from shore, and what it left behind was a trembling that started in her hands and spread through her whole body. She looked down at her palms. The makeshift bandages she had been wearing before the rescue were gone, torn off in the water. The cuts underneath them, the old ones from days of sleeping on rough concrete, were now joined by new ones, deeper ones from the twisted metal of the car door. Blood mixed with river water ran in thin pink lines down her wrists. She watched the crowd close around the man she had pulled from the water. She heard sirens getting closer. She saw the red and white lights flicker through the trees, painting the underside of the bridge in alternating waves of color. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her that this was how the world worked. The people with homes and cars and phones would rush in now that the danger had passed. They would wrap the man in blankets and load him into an ambulance, and someone would call it a miracle, and the cameras would arrive and the story would be told, and none of it, not one frame of it, would include the girl in the oversized jacket who had actually gone into the water. She wasn't bitter about it. Bitterness requires surprise, and Wren Calloway had stopped being surprised by invisibility a long time ago. She stood up and walked away, back down the embankment, back under the bridge. back into the dark, the corner of the invisible space that had been her home for 8 months. She wrung out her jacket, the water falling in heavy streams onto the concrete. She tore strips from an old t-shirt in her backpack and wrapped them around her hands, pulling tight with her teeth wincing as the fabric pressed against the fresh cuts. Then she curled up against the concrete wall and pulled the thin blanket over her legs. Her whole body shook, not from the cold, from something she couldn't name. Something that felt like all the adrenaline in the world draining out at once, leaving behind a hollow so deep she could hear it echo. She had saved a man's life, and nobody knew her name. By the time the ambulance arrived at the river, the girl was gone. Two paramedics worked on Gar under a canopy of phone flashlights and red emergency strobes. They stabilized his neck, packed the gash on his forehead, started an IV in the back of the ambulance while a young EMT cut away his soaked jacket and found the Hells Angels patch beneath it. The EMT paused for half a second, then kept working. That was not his business. Breathing was his business. Gar arrived at Baptist Medical Center, Jacksonville, just after 11 at night. He was unconscious for 6 hours. When he woke, the room was quiet except for the steady rhythm of machines and the low hum of fluorescent lights. His body felt like it had been taken apart and put back together by someone in a hurry. Every breath was a negotiation between his ribs and his lungs. His left eye was swollen half shut. His right hand was wrapped in gauze where something had torn the skin during the crash. The first face he saw was Colt Breedlove. Colt was sitting in the chair beside the bed, boots on the floor, cut still on arms folded across his chest. He was 38 years old and had ridden with the Florida chapter for 14 years. He was not a man who showed much on his face. But when Gar's eyes opened, something shifted behind Colt's expression. Relief, and beneath it something harder. Two more brothers stood by the door. Another sat on the windowsill. The room was small and they filled it completely leather and denim, and the faint smell of road exhaust, a pocket of their world planted inside the sterile white of the hospital. Gar tried to speak. His voice came out cracked and thin, barely above a whisper. Colt leaned forward. Take your time. Gar swallowed. His throat felt like it had been scoured with sand. Slowly in fragments, he told them what he remembered. The dark highway, the river running alongside the road black and high from the rain, the headlights in his mirror, the truck cutting into his lane without warning, the guardrail folding like wet paper. He described the water, how fast it came, how cold, how it stole the air from his lungs 1 inch at a time while his hands pushed against a door that would not open. He described the moment he understood he was going to die, not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a weight settling over his chest that had nothing to do with the river. Then he stopped. His jaw tightened. He looked at the ceiling for a long moment. There was a girl. The room went still. Young, skinny, clothes hanging off her. She came out of nowhere. He paused, swallowing hard. I saw her through this window. She was pulling on the door. Her hands were bleeding. He described her face through the distorted glass, the fear in her eyes that matched his own. The moment the door finally gave and water rushed in and she reached through it anyway, wrapping her arms around his chest, pulling him free with a strength that did not belong to someone that small. She dragged me to the bank, he said quietly. All the way up, and then she was gone. Silence held the room. Colt looked at the men by the door. They looked back. Nobody had an answer. Who was she? Gar asked. Nothing. No name. No description beyond what Gar had given. No one on the road had spoken to her. No one had seen where she went. She had appeared from the dark, done the impossible, and vanished back into it. The door opened. Two detectives from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office stepped in. Their expressions were measured, their voices careful, planned. The detectives asked about enemies, about threats, about anyone who might have reason to want him dead. Gar told them about the meeting. He told them everything. Let me take you back to the moment this all started. Not the crash, not the river. Earlier, hours before the water, hours before the guardrail collapsed like it had been waiting all day for permission. Earlier that same day, before the river and the dark and the fight for breath, Gar had been sitting at a scarred wooden table inside the Hells Angels clubhouse on the outskirts of Jacksonville. The building was a converted warehouse, cinder block walls, steel roll-up door, The smell of old motor oil soaked so deep into the concrete floor that no amount of cleaning would ever pull it out. The walls were lined with framed photographs, chapter patches from decades past, and a single American flag mounted above the bar that had hung there since the chapter was founded. A pool table sat in the back corner, the felt worn thin in the center from years of use. The overhead lights were industrial, the kind that hang from chains and give everything beneath them a hard, honest edge. No soft lighting in this room, no soft anything. 11 men sat around the table that afternoon. They ranged in age from 29 to 56. Between them, they carried decades of road miles, hard decisions, and the kind of loyalty that cannot be bought because it was forged in moments where buying was not an option. These were men who had buried friends, men who had stood in courtrooms, men who had ridden through rainstorms at 3 in the morning because a brother's phone call said he needed them. Gar sat at the head. He had a way of sitting that communicated everything he needed to without speaking. Back straight, shoulders square, hands flat on the table, fingers still. His face gave away nothing. It was a face that had learned over years and through hard lessons. That expression is information, and information is currency, and you do not spend currency without reason. This was home territory, a place where respect was the currency and loyalty was the foundation, and everyone who sat at that table understood the rules, even the ones that existed outside the law. The meeting had not been scheduled. That alone was a problem. Unscheduled meetings meant someone had decided the normal channels did not apply to them. It meant someone believed they were important enough to skip the protocol. In Gar's world, that kind of assumption was already a form of disrespect. The door opened and 3 men walked in. None of them belonged there. Their clothes were expensive and deliberate, chosen to project authority without affiliation. No cuts, no patches, no colors, just dark jackets, clean shoes, and the kind of posture that said they expected to be heard. They took seats without asking. One of them, the oldest, maybe 60-65, set a leather folder on the table and opened it like he was presenting a quarterly report. His voice was calm and rehearsed. He talked about business opportunities, about distribution routes, about using the chapter's network and territory to move product through Northeast Florida. Gar listened without expression. His hands stayed flat on the table. His eyes moved between the 3 men cataloging details. The expensive watch on the older man's wrist, the way the youngest of the 3 kept glancing at the door, measuring the distance. The folder itself, real documents inside printed on heavy paper, the kind that comes from a law office. The pitch went on for 10 minutes. The older man talked about money, significant money, and about protection, the kind that came from having friends inside courthouses and police precincts. He talked about routes that were already established, infrastructure that was already in place. And then near the end, his voice dropped half a register and the language shifted. He mentioned people, not product, people being moved. Vulnerable people, young people routed through a network that connected foster care facilities to private buyers. He described it the way someone describes supply chain logistics, efficiently, clinically, as if the cargo were something other than children. The room went cold. Gar let the man finish. He let the silence sit for 5 full seconds after the last word. Then he stood. The chair scraped against the concrete floor. His voice carried no hesitation and no heat when he spoke. Low and even and absolutely final. He told them they did not deal in poison, that drugs destroyed families and communities, and that was not their game and never had been and never would be. Then he looked at each of them one by one and made it clear. They did not traffic people. Children were sacred, non-negotiable. Anyone who thought otherwise had no place at that table in that building or on any road his brothers rode. Get out. The word landed like a blade on a butcher's block. Clean and final. The 3 men stood. The older one closed his folder. The younger one's hand drifted toward his jacket and then stopped when he saw how many eyes were on him. They moved toward the door. The older man paused at the threshold. He turned back just enough to let his voice carry across the room. Accidents happen, Gar. The door closed behind them, but the weight of those words stayed pressing down on every man in the room like a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Gar had drawn a line, and lines like that in worlds like his don't go unanswered. Now lying in the hospital bed staring at the forensic photograph of a guardrail that had been surgically weakened, Gar understood exactly what that line had cost. The crash was the answer. The river was the message. And if a girl hadn't come out of nowhere and done what 20 bystanders couldn't, the message would have been delivered in full. He looked at Colt. That meeting, the three men. Colt nodded slowly. The older one, Gar said. Clean hands, expensive watch, talked like a lawyer. He mentioned courthouses, said he had friends in the system. The detective leaned forward. Can you describe him further? Gar closed his eyes. The image was there sharp despite the concussion because his instincts had cataloged the man the moment he walked in. Silver hair, tall, mid-60s, the posture of someone who had spent decades being obeyed. And beneath the calm, polished surface, something else. Something that Gar had seen in men before. The absolute certainty that consequences were for other people. I don't know his name, Gar said, but he's not a street dealer. He's not a gang leader. He's something else, something connected. The detective exchanged a glance with his partner. A look that carried weight, the kind of look that means a suspicion has just been confirmed. We may already have an idea, the detective said carefully. There's an ongoing federal investigation into trafficking through foster care systems in Northeast Florida. The name that keeps coming up is a retired federal judge, Preston Mercer. The name hung in the air like smoke. Judge Preston Mercer, 64 years old, retired from the bench 3 years ago after a career that most people would call distinguished. He had overseen family court cases for 15 years. He had given keynote speeches at judicial conferences about protecting vulnerable youth. His photograph hung in the corridor of the Duval County Courthouse, one of a row of former judges who had served with what the plaque beneath it called honor and distinction. He had signed his name to thousands of custody rulings, foster care placements, and juvenile dispositions. He had shaken hands with governors. He had been profiled in the Florida Times-Union as a champion of children's welfare. The profile had run with a photograph of Mercer standing in front of a group home, smiling, his hand resting on the shoulder of a 12-year-old boy. The boy's name was never published. He was in the system, one of Mercer's cases. A success story, the article said. A child placed in a safe home through the judge's careful oversight. That boy had disappeared 9 months later. No investigation, no follow-up. His file was closed with a single notation, reunified with family. There was no family. And according to the federal investigation that was slowly, painstakingly being assembled piece by piece across multiple agencies, Mercer had spent at least the last decade using his position and his connections to build a trafficking network that ran through the very system designed to protect children. Foster care placements, group homes, emergency shelters. Mercer had connections in all of them. Caseworkers who owed him favors, administrators who looked the other way, facility directors who received monthly deposits into accounts that had no names attached. A pipeline that moved vulnerable kids, the ones nobody was looking for, the ones who had fallen through every crack the system had, from state custody into private hands. For money, for favors, for the kind of power that exists in the space between what is legal and what is simply never punished. The system was designed to be invisible. Kids in foster care move all the time. They change homes, change schools, change caseworkers. A child who disappears from one facility and appears at another raises no alarms. A child who disappears entirely raises few. The paperwork exists. The signatures are there. Everything looks correct on paper because the man who designed the paper trail spent 40 years learning exactly what correct looked like. Dale Sykes was his fixer. 35 years old, ex-military, 2 tours in Afghanistan, honorable discharge followed by a dishonorable silence. The kind of man who understood orders and chain of command and didn't ask questions about the parts that happened behind closed doors. Sykes had been with Mercer for 6 years. He handled the logistics, the transportation, the vehicles, the communication. And when someone threatened to expose the operation or refused to cooperate, Sykes handled that too. An angle grinder on a guardrail, a truck with no plates, a stretch of dark highway next to a deep, fast river. Simple, clean, deniable. The kind of thing that would look like a tragic accident in the morning paper and be forgotten by the evening news. Except Gar was still alive. And the reason he was still alive was somewhere out in the dark under a bridge, wrapping her bleeding hands in strips of an old t-shirt, shaking from cold. She had stopped trying to fight. Gar stared at the ceiling of the hospital room. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly above him. His chest hurt with every breath. His head pounded in a slow, thick rhythm that matched his heartbeat. The medication made everything feel slightly distant, as if the world were happening on the other side of a pane of glass. But beneath the pain, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the chemical fog, and the dull roar of everything that had happened in the last 12 hours, something else was building. Not anger, not yet. Anger was a luxury he could not afford until he knew exactly where to point it. Unfocused anger was a waste. It burned fuel and produced nothing. That would come later, cold and focused and surgical, aimed at the people who deserved it and no one else. This was something older, something deeper, something that lived in the code he had built his entire adult life around, in the rules that governed how his world worked, rules that most people outside it would never understand, but that every man in this room had sworn to uphold. A debt had been created tonight, not a financial debt, not a favor to be returned over beers or settled with a handshake. A life debt, the oldest kind, the kind that exists in every culture, every tradition, every corner of the world, where men have gathered and agreed on what honor means. Someone had risked their life to save his. Not a brother, not a friend, not someone who owed him anything or stood to gain anything. A girl with nothing, no name, no home, no reason to care about a stranger drowning in a car at the bottom of a river. She had gone into that water when 20 people stood on the road and watched. She had pulled him free with hands that were already bleeding before she started. She had dragged 200 pounds of dead weight through a current that was trying to kill them both. And then she had disappeared. Like it was nothing. Like saving a life was just another thing that happened between sundown and sunrise for a girl who slept on concrete. In Gar's world, that kind of debt did not go unpaid. It could not. It was not a suggestion or a guideline or a nice thing to do when convenient. It was an obligation that sat at the center of everything, as essential as breathing, as non-negotiable as gravity. The foundation of everything he had built, the loyalty, the brotherhood, the code that held his chapter together through 11 years of leading men through situations that would have broken lesser organizations, all of it rested on one principle. You take care of the people who take care of yours. He looked at Colt, then at the men by the door, then back at Colt. Find her. 2 words. That was all it took. Colt stood. He didn't ask questions. Didn't ask for a description. Didn't ask how or where or what resources they had. He just nodded once, pulled out his phone, and walked out of the room. The other men followed. Within the hour, the first calls went out. Every member of the Florida chapter received the same message. By morning, 38 men had answered. The search for the girl who saved the president's life had begun. And somewhere beneath a bridge on the banks of the St. Johns River, Wren Calloway lay curled against a concrete wall, shivering her hands, throbbing her clothes still damp, watching the water move past in the dark. She had no idea what was coming. No idea that a man she had pulled from the river was lying in a hospital bed, jaw set, eyes hard, making a promise that would change the course of her life. She thought about the river, about the weight of the man in her arms, about the sound his lungs made when the air came back. She thought about the 20 people standing on the road above phones, out voices, shouting, bodies frozen. Nobody had moved, nobody except her. She flexed her torn hands in the dark and stared at the cracked face of her mother's watch. Still broken, still keeping no time at all, but still on her wrist. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would be hungry again. Tomorrow she would be invisible again. Tomorrow nothing would be different. But she was wrong about that, because 38 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club were about to tear this city apart looking for her. And when they found her, they would bring something that no amount of money could buy and no amount of time could replace. They would bring a door that locked from the inside and a seat at a table where her name meant something. But none of that mattered yet. What mattered right now, in this moment, was something much simpler. The girl who had been invisible for 8 months had done something that no one standing in the light had been willing to do. She had gone into the dark water. She had grabbed hold of a stranger, and she had refused to let go. That was the beginning of everything. And what Wren didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she lay shivering beneath that bridge, was that the man who ordered Gar's death was already making his next move, because Judge Preston Mercer had heard that the crash didn't finish the job. And men like Mercer do not leave loose ends. Not ever. The phone call came at 2 in the morning. Dale Sykes picked up on the first ring. He was sitting in a parking lot 6 miles from the river, engine running, waiting for the kind of call that only comes when things have gone wrong. "He's alive," the voice on the other end said. Sykes said nothing for a long moment. He watched the windshield wipers push rain back and forth across the glass, steady as a metronome. "Someone pulled him out." "Who?" "Nobody knows. Some kid. Came out of nowhere." Sykes exhaled slowly. He reached forward and turned off the wipers. The rain covered the windshield in a sheet of water that turned the parking lot lights into shapeless blurs. "Find out who," the voice said, "and handle it." The line went dead. Sykes sat in the dark car for a full minute. Then he put it in gear and drove north toward the river, toward the bridge, toward the place where a girl with scarred hands was trying to sleep. The rain was coming down harder now. The river was still rising. Under the bridge, Wren lay with her knees pulled to her chest, her hands wrapped in the makeshift bandages, listening to the water move past. She did not know that a retired judge had ordered her found. She did not know that a man named Dale Sykes was driving toward her through the rain with instructions that left no room for ambiguity. She did not know that the stranger she had pulled from a sinking car was the president of a motorcycle club that was at this very moment making phone calls to every chapter in the state of Florida. She knew only what she had always known, that the world was cold, that the ground was hard, that nobody was coming, that the space beneath this bridge was the only square footage on Earth that belonged to her, and even that could be taken away at any moment by a cop with a flashlight or a city crew with a pressure washer. She had learned to live without certainty, without safety, without the basic fundamental assumption that most people carry through their days without even knowing they carry it, the assumption that tomorrow will look roughly like today and that the ground beneath your feet will still be there when you wake up. She had no such assumption. She had the bridge, the backpack, the broken watch, and the memory of a man's lungs filling with air on a riverbank because she had decided for reasons she could not fully explain even to herself that he would not die tonight. But on this particular night, for the first time in 8 months, Wren Calloway was wrong about nobody coming, because two different forces were now converging on the same stretch of river, moving through the dark, heading toward the same bridge, the same girl with intentions that could not have been more different. On one side, 38 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club were making phone calls, pulling on boots, warming up engines. By morning, they would be on the road. Every shelter in Northeast Florida would be visited. Every bridge and underpass and abandoned lot would be checked. They were looking for the girl who had saved their president's life, and they were bringing something with them. Not money, not weapons. Something the girl under the bridge had not been offered in 8 months and had stopped believing existed. A place to belong. On the other side, Dale Sykes was driving north through the rain, with the window cracked 2 inches cold air cutting across his face, a burner phone on the seat beside him, and a set of instructions that he understood perfectly without needing them spelled out. Find the girl, find out what she saw, make sure she never talks about it. Sykes had done this kind of work before. He was efficient, he was patient, he did not make mistakes, and he had a 6-hour head start on the men who were still making phone calls. The distance between the bridge and his headlights was shrinking. The rain kept falling, the river kept rising, and Wren Calloway slept beneath the concrete, her torn hands folded beneath her chin, her mother's broken watch still on her wrist, dreaming of nothing because dreaming requires believing that something better is possible, and she had given that up a long time ago. The race had begun, and Wren didn't even know she was running. Dale Sykes arrived at the bridge 40 minutes before dawn. He parked the truck 200 yards south, killed the engine, and sat listening. Rain tapped against the roof in an uneven rhythm. The river was louder here, amplified by the concrete underpass, a steady low roar that swallowed smaller sounds the way a furnace swallows paper. He reached under the seat and pulled out a flashlight, the heavy kind black aluminum, the kind that works as a weapon when it needs to. He stepped out into the rain and walked toward the bridge. The underpass was exactly the kind of place he expected. Damp concrete, the smell of old urine and river clay. Graffiti on the support columns, most of it faded, some of it fresh. Broken glass near the south entrance. A shopping cart with no wheels sitting on its side like a dead animal. He swept the flashlight across the space. Slowly, methodically. The beam picked up cardboard, flattened and stacked. A plastic sheet pinned to the wall with duct tape. A torn blanket, still damp, wadded into a ball near the base of the column. An old t-shirt with strips torn from the bottom, the fabric stained with something dark that could have been mud or could have been blood. Someone had been here, recently, but not now. Sykes crouched beside the blanket and touched it. Cold, wet, but not soaking. Whoever had been sleeping here had left within the last few hours. He shone the light along the ground, looking for footprints, for a direction, for anything that would tell him which way the girl had gone. Nothing. The rain had washed the concrete clean. He stood and walked the perimeter of the underpass, checking both entrances, scanning the tree line on either side. Empty. The bridge groaned above him as a truck crossed overhead, the vibration traveling through the columns and into his boots. He pulled the burner phone from his pocket and dialed. She's gone, moved within the last couple hours. A pause on the other end, then the voice calm and measured the way it always was. Shelters, she'll go where it's warm. I'll check the usual ones. Do it quietly, no footprint. The line went dead. Sykes pocketed the phone and walked back to the truck. He did not rush. Rushing was for men who were afraid of being too late. Sykes was never too late. He was methodical. He was patient. He understood that finding someone who didn't want to be found was not a sprint, but a process of elimination, a slow tightening of the net until the only place left was the one where the target was standing. What Sykes did not know, what he could not have known, was that Wren had not gone to a shelter. She had not gone anywhere warm. She had woken 2 hours before dawn, restless and aching, her hands throbbing beneath the makeshift bandages, and she had done what she always did when a place stopped feeling safe. She moved. Not far, just far enough. 3 blocks east, there was a laundromat on Atlantic Boulevard that stayed open 24 hours. The owner, a heavy woman named Doreen who smelled like fabric softener and menthol cigarettes, allowed homeless people to sit inside during the overnight hours as long as they didn't bother the machines or the customers. Wren had used it before on the coldest nights when the bridge felt too exposed and the wind came off the river in sheets that cut through every layer she owned. She sat in the back corner on a plastic chair, her backpack between her feet, her hands hidden in the sleeves of her jacket. The dryers hummed and tumbled. The fluorescent lights buzzed. A man in work boots was folding laundry at the center table, his movements slow and precise, the kind of focus that comes from doing something simple after doing something hard. He didn't look at Wren. Nobody looked at Wren. She sat there until the sun came up. Then she left. The first day of the search began with engines. By 7 in the morning, 38 motorcycles were staged in the parking lot behind the Hells Angels clubhouse on the outskirts of Jacksonville. The men stood in loose groups, coffee in hand, breath visible in the early chill. No one spoke loudly. There was no rally speech, no dramatic address from a podium. Colt Breedlove stood by the door with a city map spread across the hood of a pickup truck, sections marked in red ink areas, divided routes assigned. The plan was simple because simple plans survive contact with the real world and complicated plans don't. They would split into groups of 4 and 5. Each group would take a section of the city: shelters, soup kitchens, underpasses, abandoned buildings, encampments along the river. Any place where a young woman without a home might find a few hours of rest. They had one description: young, thin, 18 or close to it, oversized jacket, mismatched shoes, bandaged hands, probably scared, probably running. Nobody saves one of ours and disappears into nothing. That was what Colt had said the night before, and it had become the operating phrase repeated quietly among the men as they mounted up and pulled out of the lot in formation, 4 abreast, the sound of their engines rolling through the warehouse district like a slow, deliberate heartbeat. The city noticed. Jacksonville is not a small town. It is the largest city by area in the contiguous United States, sprawling across nearly 900 square miles of river delta pine flats and coastal marsh. Finding one person in that expanse, one person who did not want to be found, who had spent 8 months learning how to be invisible, was not a matter of effort. It was a matter of persistence, patience, and the willingness to look in places most people preferred not to see. The first day produced nothing. They visited 7 shelters. The volunteers and staff were wary at first, the way anyone is when a group of men in leather and patches walks through the door. But the brothers were careful. They asked questions without pressure. They described the girl without naming her because they didn't have a name. They left phone numbers and asked to be called if anyone matching the description came through. At the Sulzbacher Center downtown, a case manager listened to Colt's description and shook her head slowly. "We get a lot of young women through here," she said. "Most of them don't stay long. Most of them don't give real names." "This one would have had bandaged hands," Colt said. "Fresh injuries, probably within the last day or two." The case manager thought about it, then she shook her head again. "I'll keep an eye out." At a soup kitchen on the west side, an older volunteer, a man with a white beard and a veteran's cap, said he thought he might have seen someone matching the description 2 days ago. A girl eating alone in the corner ends, wrapped in cloth, wearing a jacket that was too big. She had finished her food in under 4 minutes and left without speaking to anyone. "Which direction?" Colt asked. The old man pointed east, toward the river. They followed. They found nothing. By the end of the first day, the local news had picked up the story. Not the rescue, not the girl. They picked up the motorcycles. 38 Hells Angels rolling through Jacksonville in formation, stopping at shelters and underpasses, asking questions, moving on. A reporter from Channel 4 parked outside the Sulzbacher Center and filmed the bikes as they pulled away. The footage ran on the evening broadcast with a headline that read, "Biker Invasion" or something else. The anchor speculated about territory disputes. A retired police captain brought on it as a commentator suggested it could be connected to gang activity in the area. Nobody mentioned the river. Nobody mentioned the girl. Nobody asked the men on the motorcycles what they were actually doing because nobody thought to approach them and ask. That was fine. The brothers didn't need the media to find one girl. They needed shoe leather and patience, and the understanding that the streets of Jacksonville held an invisible city within the visible one, a city of doorways and bridge underpasses and abandoned lots where thousands of people lived without being seen. The second day was harder. Fatigue settled in. Not physical fatigue. These were men who had ridden through rainstorms and desert heat for decades, but the fatigue of searching for someone who left no trace. Wren Calloway had spent 8 months learning how to be a ghost. She moved when it was dark. She stayed in places where cameras didn't reach. She never returned to the same spot twice in a row. She was by necessity and by instinct extraordinarily difficult to find. The groups fanned out wider, north to Ocean Way, south to Mandarin, west to the industrial strip along Beaver Street, where the warehouses sat empty and the fences had holes large enough to walk through. They checked places that hadn't been on the original map, abandoned construction sites, a closed car wash on Phillips Highway where someone had been sleeping behind the dumpster, a drainage culvert near the airport where a handmade shelter of tarps and pallets sat empty, the fire pit out front still warm. Close, always close, but never close enough. Meanwhile, Dale Sykes was conducting his own search. Quieter, slower, more precise. He visited the same shelters the brothers had visited, but he came alone in civilian clothes with a story about a missing niece and a worried family. He was polite, soft-spoken. The kind of man who makes eye contact and nods in the right places and leaves an impression of concern that is almost impossible to distinguish from the real thing. At the Sulzbacher Center, the same case manager who had spoken to Colt now spoke to Sykes. She gave him the same answer. She did not connect the two visits. Why would she? One was a biker in leather. The other was a man in a clean polo shirt with worry lines around his eyes. Sykes was thorough. He checked 3 shelters, 2 soup kitchens in the parking lot of a church on the south side that was known for letting people sleep in the back pews during winter months. He spoke to homeless men under the I-95 overpass, offering cigarettes, asking casual questions. "Have you seen a young girl about 18 bandaged hands might be sleeping rough somewhere near the river?" Nobody had seen her. Or if they had, they didn't say. The unwritten code of the street is simple. You don't tell strangers where other people sleep. Not ever. That code had kept Wren alive for 8 months. It was keeping her alive now, though she didn't know it. By the evening of the second day, Sykes reported back to Mercer. No contact, no confirmed sighting. The girl was mobile and careful and had no pattern that he could identify from the outside. Mercer's response was brief. "Expand the search, use the shelters." Sykes understood. The shelters weren't just places to look. They were places Mercer had access to. Caseworkers on his payroll. Staff who owed him debts from the years when he sat on the bench and decided which facilities received funding and which ones didn't. If the girl surfaced at any of those shelters, Mercer would know within the hour. The net was tightening, slowly. invisibly, from a direction that Wren couldn't see. But the brothers were tightening their own net. And on the morning of the third day, Colt Breedlove did something that changed everything. He stopped searching, not out of frustration, not out of defeat, out of instinct. Colt had spent 14 years riding with men who understood that the hardest problems are not solved by trying harder. They are solved by thinking differently. He went back to the beginning. He rode alone to the river, to the bridge, to the exact spot where Gar's car had gone into the water 3 nights before. The guardrail was still broken, the gap cordoned off with yellow caution tape that flapped in the breeze. Tire marks scarred the pavement in a dark curve that ended at the edge. Below, the river moved on indifferent, carrying no memory of what it had tried to take. Colt dismounted and walked to the bridge underpass. He stood where Wren had slept. He looked at the cardboard, the plastic sheeting, the torn blanket. He noticed details the way a man notices details when he has spent his life paying attention to things that other people overlook. The cardboard was layered 3 sheets thick, arranged to create insulation from the concrete. The plastic sheeting was oriented to block the prevailing wind, which came from the northwest along the river. The blanket was positioned against the column that received the least splash from the roadway drainage above. This was not random. This was engineered. Someone who slept here understood exposure, understood wind direction, understood the architecture of survival. This was someone who had been doing this for a long time and had gotten very, very good at it. Colt looked at the river, then he looked at the road above. Then he looked east toward the line of small businesses and strip malls that ran along Atlantic Boulevard. If he were 18 years old and had just risked his life in freezing water, if his hands were torn and his clothes were soaked, and his shelter had been compromised by the attention the rescue had generated, where would he go? Somewhere warm, somewhere anonymous, somewhere within walking distance, because a girl without money and without a car does not travel far. He got back on the bike and rode east, slowly, scanning both sides of the road, past a gas station, past a check-cashing place with bars on the windows, past a pawn shop and a tire store, and a vacant lot where a building had burned down and never been rebuilt. Then he saw the laundromat, open 24 hours. The sign was old, the letters sun-faded, but the lights inside were on, and the door was propped open with a cinder block. He pulled into the lot and shut off the engine. Inside, the air was thick with humidity and the chemical sweetness of dryer sheets. 3 machines were running. A woman in a housecoat was reading a magazine at the folding table. A teenager with headphones sat on the floor near the vending machines, not washing anything, just sitting. Colt approached the counter. A heavy woman stood behind it, arms folded, watching him with the calm, unsurprised expression of someone who had seen everything walk through her door. "Help you. I'm looking for a young woman, about 18. Thin, would have had bandaged hands, might have been in here in the last day or 2. The woman studied him. Her eyes moved from his face to his cut to the patches on his vest and back to his face. She took her time. "You a cop?" "No." "You her father?" "No." "Then why are you looking for her?" Colt could have given a long answer. He could have explained the rescue, the river, the debt, the coastal. He could have told the whole story. Instead, he said the only thing that mattered. "She saved someone I care about. I want to make sure she's safe." The woman held his gaze for a long time. Something shifted behind her eyes, the careful evaluation of a person who has learned to protect the people who come through her door. Then she nodded once. Skinny girl, big jacket, hands all wrapped up. She was here night before last, sat in the back until sunrise. Did she say where she was going? Kids like that don't say where they're going. They just give it to. Has she been back? Not yet, but she will. They always come back to the places that were warm. Colt thanked her and left. He sat on the bike in the parking lot for a long moment, hands resting on the tank, thinking. The girl had been here. 40 hours ago. She was mobile, but she was circling, staying within range of the river, within range of the bridge that had been her home. She would come back. He called the clubhouse and gave his report. Then he parked the bike behind the laundromat out of sight from the street and waited. He waited through the afternoon. He waited through the evening. He watched the sun go down and the streetlights come on and the traffic thin out until Atlantic Boulevard was quiet enough to hear the river in the distance. He drank coffee from a gas station cup and ate a granola bar from his saddlebag and did not move from his position. At 11:40 that night, a figure appeared at the east end of the parking lot. Small, thin, moving with the particular gait of someone who is both exhausted and alert, the walk of a person who is always scanning, always measuring, always calculating the distance between themselves and the nearest exit. An oversized jacket hung from narrow shoulders. The shoes were mismatched, one dark, one lighter. The hands were tucked into the sleeves. She walked toward the laundromat's open door. She paused at the entrance, leaning slightly to look inside, checking who was there, how many where they were sitting. Then she stepped inside. Colt gave her 5 minutes. He wanted her to sit down, to settle, to feel the warmth of the dryers in the safety of a public space with other people in it. He did not want her to feel ambushed. Then he walked in. She saw him immediately. Her head snapped up the way an animal's does when the brush moves wrong. Every muscle in her body tensed. Her eyes went to his, cut his patches the size of him, and in that instant, Colt could see the calculation happening. Distance to the back door. Weight difference. Whether the woman behind the counter would help or look away. He stopped 10 feet from her. He kept his hands visible. He spoke quietly, the way you speak to something that might bolt. "You okay?" No answer. Her gaze flicked left, then right, measuring. "My name is Colt. I ride with the Hells Angels, Florida chapter." He paused, letting the words sit. "A few nights ago, you pulled a man out of the river." She froze. The calculation in her eyes changed. Fear was still there, but now it was joined by something else. Confusion. And beneath that, barely visible, the first tremor of something that might have been hope if she had been willing to recognize it. "You're not in trouble," he said. That didn't seem to land. Her shoulders stayed tight. Her weight was still forward, still ready to run. "We've been looking for you, the whole chapter. 3 days. He took a single step closer. Not aggressive, just present. "The man you pulled out of that river is Pangar. He's the president of our chapter. He wants to meet you." Something cracked in her expression. Small, almost imperceptible. The way a frozen lake cracks in spring, not breaking, just shifting, admitting for the first time that something underneath is still moving. "Why?" she asked. One word, barely above a whisper. "Because a man doesn't forget something like that." She looked down at her hands. The bandages were fresh, redone that morning, with strips from a shirt she had found in a donation box behind a thrift store. The cuts beneath them were starting to close the skin tight and itching, the kind of healing that reminds you of the injury with every movement. She had done something extraordinary 3 nights ago, and the world had continued as if it hadn't happened. She had gone back to being hungry and cold and invisible. She had started to wonder if the rescue had even been real, or if it was just another thing that happened to someone else while she watched from the outside. Now a man she had never seen before was standing in a laundromat, telling her that people had been looking for her, that the man she pulled from the river had a name, that he wanted to meet her. She stood slowly. She did not drop her guard. 8 months on the street had taught her that hope is the most dangerous feeling a person can have, because hope makes you stop watching the exits. But she nodded. Colt walked her to the bike. The contrast was stark and immediate. Clean leather beside torn fabric. Polished chrome beside mismatched laces. Confidence beside survival. Two worlds touching at their edges, connected by a single act on a riverbank 3 nights before. He offered her the spare helmet. She took it, turning it over in her bandaged hands, studying it like she had never held one before. She put it on. It was too big. It sat loose on her head, the visor slightly crooked. She didn't adjust it. They rode through the dark streets of Jacksonville, past the river, past the bridge, past the place where none of this had started and all of it had. The engine rumbled beneath them, and the night air was cool against her jacket, and for the first time in 8 months, Ren Calloway was moving towards something instead of away from it. She didn't know what was waiting for her. She didn't know that a room full of 38 men in leather and patches would be standing in silence when she walked through the door. She didn't know that the man she had pulled from the water would be there, arm in a sling, stitches across his forehead, looking at her with an expression that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with gratitude. She didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that the engine was warm beneath her and the wind was cold on her face, and someone had come looking for her. That had never happened before. The clubhouse was lit from inside, a warm glow spilling through the small windows and the gap beneath the steel roll-up door. Colt pulled around the back, parked the bike, and dismounted. Wren stayed on the seat for a moment, hands still gripping the passenger rail, staring at the building like it might swallow her. "Whenever you're ready," Colt said. She swung her leg over and stood. She pulled off the helmet and held it against her chest like a shield. Her hair was flat and tangled beneath it. Her jacket hung crooked on her shoulders. Her bandaged hands shook slightly, though whether from cold or from something else she couldn't tell. Colt opened the door. The room was full, wall to wall. 38 men stood in silence, leather in patches forming a solid, unmoving half circle around the open space near the entrance. No one spoke. No one smiled. Every eye in the room rested on the thin girl in the oversized jacket who had just stepped in and stopped. The silence was enormous. It pressed against her from all sides. She could feel their attention like a physical weight, and every instinct she had, every reflex that had kept her alive on the streets, told her to turn around and run. Then Gar stepped forward. He moved slower than the man she remembered from the river, one arm held in a sling, fresh stitches cutting a precise line across his forehead, still dark with dried blood at the edges. He had lost weight in the 3 days since the crash, the way people do when their body is spending all its energy on repair. But his eyes were clear, steady, fixed on her with an intensity that made the air between them feel compressed. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to give her room. "You saved my life." Wren swallowed. Her throat was dry. Her voice, when it came, was barely a sound. "Anyone would have done it." Gar shook his head, slowly. "Once. No, they didn't. 20 people stood on that road. Phones out, voices shouting. Not one of them moved." He paused. "You were the only one who did." The words hit harder than she expected, not because they were new information. She had been there. She knew what had happened. She knew about the 20 people on the road. But hearing it said out loud by the man himself standing in front of her, with stitches in his face and his arm in a sling, turned a private memory into something public, something real, something that could not be undone or dismissed or folded up and put away. She shifted her weight, uncomfortable with the attention, unsure where to look. Gar didn't rush her. "I owe you a debt," he continued. "We all do, and where I come from, we pay our debts." Wren lifted her hand slightly. The bandages were visible, the cloth stained and fraying. "I don't want anything," she said quickly. "I'm fine." Gar studied her for a long moment. His gaze moved from her face to her hands to her shoes to the jacket that hung off her like a tent. He took in the details the way he always did, not with judgment, but with the precise, unflinching assessment of a man who has spent his life reading the distance between what people say and what is true. "You're homeless," he said quietly. "You're hungry. You're alone." He paused. "That's not fine." He took a step closer. "And you're not alone anymore." Something in Wren broke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the sound of a wall giving way after holding too long a structure that had been built out of necessity and maintained through sheer will, finally reaching the point where it could not hold another ounce of pressure. Her shoulders sagged first, then her face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them, and she turned her head, ashamed, pressing her bandaged hand against her mouth, as if she could physically hold the emotion back. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. Nobody shifted uncomfortably. These were men who understood what it cost to hold yourself together when everything around you was falling apart. They had seen it in each other. They had lived it themselves. And they stood in that silence with a respect that required no words and no explanation. Gar placed a hand on her shoulder. Steady, real. The weight of it was almost unbearable, not because it was heavy, but because it was the first time anyone had touched her with kindness in 8 months. "This isn't charity," he said. "Respect goes both ways. You earned this." He told her there was work if she wanted it. Honest work at the auto shop the chapter owned on the west side. He told her there was a place to stay, a small apartment near the shop, clean and quiet, with a door that locked from the inside. He told her there was food and there was protection, and there were people who would have her back not because she was weak, but because she had proven she was not. Around them, heads nodded, one by one. No speeches, no cheers, just agreement. The quiet collective acknowledgement that this girl, this stranger, had crossed a line the night she went into that river, and crossing it had made her something more than a stranger. She had become one of theirs. Wren wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket. She nodded slowly, still trying to understand how a single decision on a riverbank had led to this room, these faces, this offer that felt too large to hold in her hands. She hadn't jumped in for a reward. She hadn't thought about tomorrow. She had refused to walk away. That was all. And now tomorrow was standing right in front of her, wearing leather and patches and offering her a set of keys. But what Wren did not know, what nobody in that room knew except the river and the rain and the dark stretch of highway where the guardrail was still broken, was that Dale Sykes had not stopped looking. And he was getting closer. Because while Colt had found Wren at the laundromat, Sykes had found the laundromat too. He had arrived 20 minutes after Colt and Wren had left. He had spoken to Doreen behind the counter, the same woman who had pointed Colt in the right direction. He had asked his careful questions about the missing niece. And Doreen, who had no reason to connect the soft-spoken man in the polo shirt with anything dangerous, had told him exactly what she had told Colt. The girl had been there. She had been picked up by a biker. Mercer did not use muscle. He used leverage. He used the machinery of institutions, the same machinery he had operated for 4 decades, the same machinery that was designed to protect people, but could, in the right hands, be turned into a weapon more devastating than any fist or firearm. He would not send Dale Sykes crashing through the door of a motorcycle clubhouse. That was crude. That was the kind of mistake a street criminal would make. Instead, he would tighten the screws, slowly, professionally, legally, until the pressure became unbearable and the people protecting the girl decided she wasn't worth the cost. He picked up the phone and dialed the first number. The next morning, a health inspector arrived at the auto shop, unannounced, with a clipboard and a citation book and an expression that suggested he had been told exactly what to find. 2 days later, a tax auditor sent a letter requesting 14 months of financial records. The day after that, a patrol car began parking across the street from the clubhouse every evening, at 6 staying until midnight, running plates on every vehicle that came and went. The message was clear, not spoken, not written, just felt the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm moves in. Someone with power was watching. Someone with power was displeased. And someone with power intended to make their displeasure known in ways that were perfectly legal, completely deniable, and absolutely suffocating. Gar recognized it immediately. He had seen institutional pressure before. He knew what it looked like when the system decided to lean on you, not with a boot on your neck, but with 1,000 small inconveniences that added up to an impossible weight. He gathered the brothers. He explained what was happening. He did not speculate about who was behind it. He didn't need to. Every man in that room understood that the 3 men who had walked into the clubhouse weeks ago with their clean shoes and their folder full of trafficking routes had connections that reached far beyond the street. The question was simple. Do we push back or do we bend? Nobody bent. But the one who pushed back first was not Gar. It was not Colt. It was not any of the 38 men who had spent 3 days searching for her. It was Wren. She had been working at the auto shop for 3 months when she saw him. The shop was called Boone's Custom, a cinder block building on Lenox Avenue with 4 bays and air compressor that rattled like it was dying and a hand-painted sign above the entrance that needed repainting every spring. It was a legitimate business, had been for 20 years, and it made enough money to keep the lights on and the brothers employed and the taxman satisfied most of the time. Wren had started at the bottom, sweeping floors, organizing tool carts, cleaning parts in the solvent tank, until her hands smelled like mineral spirits for days afterward. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for better work. She showed up before anyone else, and she stayed after everyone left, and she watched everything with the focused intensity of someone who understood that learning was not a luxury, but a survival skill. The brothers taught her, not with speeches or formal lessons. They taught her the way men teach in shops, by doing the work beside her, by explaining with their hands as much as their words, by letting her make mistakes, and then showing her once how to fix them. How to read a torque wrench, how to bleed a brake line, how to diagnose a misfire by the sound alone, the way a doctor diagnoses a heart murmur with a stethoscope. She absorbed it all. Within 6 weeks, she was doing oil changes unsupervised. Within 2 months, she was replacing alternators and water pumps. By month 3, she had moved to breakwork, the kind of job that requires precision and patience, and the understanding that a mistake doesn't result in a callback from a dissatisfied customer, but in a 2-ton vehicle that cannot stop. The changes in her were quiet but unmistakable. Weight came back to her frame. Color returned to her face. Her shoulders stopped curling inward. She still didn't talk much, still kept to the edges of group conversations, still flinched when a door slammed too loud. But the flinch was getting smaller. The edges were getting closer to the center. She was underneath a Chevy Silverado replacing a brake line, her hands steady and competent now in ways they hadn't been when she started. Grease under her fingernails instead of concrete dust. Calluses from tools instead of from cold. She had learned fast the way people learn when the alternative to learning is going back to a bridge. She slid out from under the truck to grab a socket wrench and look toward the street. A man was standing on the sidewalk across from the shop, hands in his pockets, clean clothes, clean shoes, watching. She recognized him, not from the river, not from the crime, from before. The shelter, downtown, 8 months ago. The man with the calm voice and the clean fingernails who had asked her questions that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Where do you want to go? Does anyone know you're here? Would anyone notice if you left Dale Sykes?" The socket wrench hit the concrete floor with a clatter. She didn't pick it up. She stood, wiped her hands on the shop rag, and walked straight to Gar's office in the back. "I know him." Gar looked up from the desk. "The man across the street. I've seen him before, at the shelter downtown. Before I was on the streets." Her voice was tight, controlled, but her hands, the hands that had pulled a man from a river, were shaking. He was the one asking questions about the kids, about who would notice if they were gone. The room went very still. "He's connected to the people who tried to kill you," she said. "I'm sure of it." And there it was, the connection that nobody had made. The thread that tied the river to the shelter, to the courtroom, to the retired judge who had spent a decade making children disappear. A girl who had been invisible for 8 months had just become the only living person who could put Dale Sykes inside a trafficking pipeline and tie him directly to the shelters that Judge Preston Mercer controlled. Wren had not planned this. She had not gone looking for evidence or justice or revenge. She had simply seen a face and remembered what it meant. But in that moment, standing in the doorway of an auto shop with grease on her hands and fear in her throat, she made a decision. She would not run. Not this time. "I can get proof," she said. Gar shook his head. "Too dangerous." "I know those streets," she said. "You don't." 6 words, each one a blade, and in those 6 words everything shifted. Because Wren Calloway was no longer the girl who needed saving. She was the girl who chose to fight. And the fight she was choosing was the most dangerous one available, a fight against a man who had spent 40 years inside the system that was supposed to protect people like her, a man who had weaponized that system against children, against the vulnerable, against anyone who threatened to expose what he had built. Gar looked at her for a long time. He saw the fear. He saw the resolve beneath it. He saw the hands that had pulled him from the river, steady now grease-stained, belonging to a person who had rebuilt herself from nothing in 3 months and was offering to risk it all again. "Not alone," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I go in first." The plan took 2 weeks to build. Wren would return to the shelter system. Not the same shelter. A different one on the south side, one of the facilities that appeared on the list of locations connected to Mercer's network. She would present as what she had been 8 months ago, a homeless girl with no family and no resources. She would ask for help, and she would pay very careful attention to what happened next. Gar arranged backup. Colt and 2 brothers would be within 2 blocks at all times. A burner phone was sewn into the lining of Wren's jacket. If anything went wrong, one press would bring them in. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, Wren took off the clean clothes she had been wearing for 3 months. She put on the old jacket, the mismatched shoes. She unwrapped the bandages from her hands, exposing the scars. She left her mother's watch on her wrist. She walked out of the apartment, past the auto shop, past the row of motorcycles parked in the morning sun, and turned south, toward the shelter, toward the system that had failed her, toward the man with the clean fingernails who had once asked if anyone would notice if she disappeared. This time someone would notice. This time 38 men on motorcycles would notice. But what mattered most was that Wren noticed. She had seen the face. She had made the connection. She had chosen to walk back into the fire instead of running from it. And that choice, that single deliberate, terrifying choice, was about to crack open the biggest trafficking case in Northeast Florida's history. The shelter on the south side was called New Horizons. It occupied a converted office building on Emerson Street, 3 stories of beige stucco and narrow windows, the kind of building that looks like it was designed to be forgotten. The lobby had plastic chairs and a bulletproof window at the intake desk and a poster on the wall that said "Every person matters" in a font that was supposed to be inspiring, but came across as obligatory. Wren walked in at 10 in the morning. She gave a name that wasn't hers. She said she had been sleeping rough and needed a place to stay. The woman behind the glass looked at her the way intake workers always look at people, with a practiced blend of sympathy and efficiency that processes a human being into a case number in under 4 minutes. She was given a bed on the second floor, a towel, a meal ticket, and a form to fill out that asked for her name, her age, her last known address, her emergency contact, and whether she had any family members in the area. She filled it out carefully, every answer designed to match the profile of a girl who had no one. No family, no contacts, no one who would ask questions. She was exactly the kind of person who had been disappearing from shelters connected to Preston Mercer for the last 10 years. And now she was inside, waiting, watching, with a phone sewn into her jacket and 38 reasons to believe that this time the system would not swallow her whole. The first night at New Horizons, nothing happened. Wren lay on a thin mattress on the second floor, staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the brown water stains the way a prisoner counts days. The room held 8 beds, 4 on each side, separated by plywood partitions that stopped 3 feet short of the ceiling. The air smelled like industrial disinfectant, and something older beneath it, the accumulated exhaustion of hundreds of people who had passed through these beds before her, each one carrying a weight that no amount of bleach could remove. 2 other beds were occupied. A woman in her 40s who coughed in her sleep, a wet rattling sound that echoed off the cinder block walls. And a girl who looked younger than Wren, maybe 16, curled tight against the wall with her shoes still on, the way Wren used to sleep. The way you sleep when you need to be able to run. Wren kept her jacket on. She kept her hand against the lining where the burner foam was sewn, feeling its shape through the fabric, the way a child holds a blanket. 2 blocks away, Colt Breedlove was parked in a borrowed sedan engine, off watching the building's exits. 2 blocks the other direction, another brother sat in a pickup truck with a thermos of coffee and a clear line of sight to the front door. She was not alone. She repeated it to herself like a fact she was trying to memorize. She was not alone. But the shelter felt the same way it had always felt. The same fluorescent hum. The same locked doors after 10 at night. The same careful practiced kindness from staff who processed people like paperwork, stamping each one with a case number and a meal schedule and a set of rules printed on a laminated card that hung from a lanyard around their necks. The second day she started watching. She watched the intake process. She watched which staff members handled new arrivals and which ones disappeared into the back office for long stretches. She watched the caseworker assigned to her floor, a man named Glenn, who wore khaki pants and a polo shirt with the shelter's logo, and who smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. Glenn checked on the residents twice a day, morning and evening, marking a clipboard with small, precise check marks. On the third day, Glenn sat down across from Wren in the cafeteria during lunch. He placed his clipboard on the table and folded his hands on top of it, the way a teacher sits when they want you to believe the conversation is casual. "How are you settling in, Farnham?" "Fine." "You listed no emergency contacts on your intake form." "I don't have any." "No family at all?" "No." Glenn nodded slowly. He made a note on his clipboard, small, precise. "We have resources, you know, programs that can help with housing, employment, getting back on your feet. There are people who want to help." Wren said nothing. She looked at his hands. Clean fingernails, trimmed short. The same kind of hands Dale Sykes had, the kind that are maintained rather than used. "I'll think about it," she said. Glenn smiled. It still didn't reach his eyes. Over the next 4 days, Wren cataloged everything. She noted which residents were approached by Glenn and which ones were not. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in a dark room. Glenn did not talk to everyone. He talked to the ones who matched a profile. Young, female, no family contacts, no emergency numbers, No one who would call or visit or ask where they had gone. On the sixth day, a girl named Tessa disappeared from the second floor. She had been in the bed next to Ren's, 17 years old, quiet. From somewhere in South Georgia, she said, though she never said exactly where. She had thin arms and a nervous habit of braiding and unbraiding a piece of string she kept in her pocket. She had been at New Horizons for 9 days. On the fifth night, Tessa had whispered to Ren across the plywood partition. She said Glenn had told her about a placement, a group home in Clay County. Nice place, he said. Clean beds, real meals. A program that could help her get her GED. She said Glenn was going to drive her there himself in the morning. Ren had listened in the dark. She had said nothing. But she had lain awake for hours afterward, staring at the ceiling tiles, feeling the shape of the burner phone through the lining of her jacket, her heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm that contradicted everything her mind was screaming. On the morning of the sixth day, Tessa's bed was made. Her belongings were gone. The piece of string she kept in her pocket was on the floor beside the bed frame, curled in a small loop as if it had fallen and no one had noticed. The intake worker at the front desk said she had been transferred to another facility. When Ren asked which facility, the worker glanced at a sheet of paper and said, Pine Creek. It's a group home in Clay County. Pine Creek. Ren committed the name to memory. That night in the bathroom with the water running to cover the sound, she pressed the button on the burner phone and whispered the name to Colt. Colt checked. Pine Creek Group Home in Clay County had been closed for 14 months. The building was vacant. The license had been revoked after a state inspection found safety violations. There was no operating facility called Pine Creek anywhere in Northeast Florida. Tessa had not been transferred. Tessa had been moved, and the paperwork said she had gone to a place that didn't exist. Ren stayed 2 more days. She watched Glenn process another young woman through what he called the transition program. She noted the date, the time, the name. She noted that the paperwork Glenn filled out was different from the standard transfer forms posted on the bulletin board in the staff office. The standard forms had carbon copies. Glenn's forms did not. On the 8th night, she made her move. The staff office on the first floor was locked after hours, but the lock was a push-button combination, 4 digits, and Ren had watched Glenn enter it 3 times from across the hallway, memorizing the sequence of his fingers, the way she had once memorized which alleys were safe and which ones had motion sensor lights. She waited until 2 in the morning when the overnight staff member was asleep at the front desk with a magazine open on his chest, and she walked downstairs. The hallway was dark except for the green glow of an exit sign at the far end. The linoleum floor was cold beneath her socks. She had left her shoes upstairs because shoes on linoleum make noise and noise makes questions, and questions were the one thing she could not afford. She reached the office door. She stood in front of it for 3 full seconds. Her hand raised her index finger, hovering over the keypad. In those 3 seconds, she thought about what would happen if she was caught. She thought about the apartment near the shop and the motorcycle and the jacket with the patch on the back. She thought about how much she had to lose now, how much more than she'd had 8 months ago, when the only thing at stake was a spot under a bridge. She entered the code. The lock clicked. She pushed the door open. The office was small, a desk with a coffee ring stained into the wood, a filing cabinet, gray metal 4 drawers, a computer that was password protected and useless, a calendar on the wall with a photograph of a sunset that was supposed to be calming and wasn't. The room smelled like stale coffee and copier toner, and the particular staleness of a space that is occupied during the day and abandoned at night. The filing cabinet was not locked. That was the detail that would matter later in the courtroom when the defense attorney argued that the documents had been improperly secured and therefore could not be considered confidential. The cabinet was not locked. The drawer opened. The folder was there. Inside, in the bottom drawer, behind a row of standard case files arranged alphabetically by last name, she found a separate folder. Manila. No label on the tab, thicker than the others, dog-eared at the corners from handling. Inside the folder were transfer forms, 14 of them. Each one documented a resident being moved to a facility outside the county. Each one was signed by Glenn. Each one listed a destination that Ren now suspected did not exist. And on the back of each form in small handwriting was a phone number, the same phone number on all 14 forms. Ren photographed every page with the burner phone. Her hands were steady, Her breathing was even. She had learned stillness under bridges and in doorways and in every place where being noticed meant being in danger. That stillness served her now in a different kind of darkness for a different kind of survival. She put the folder back. She closed the cabinet. She walked out of the office and back upstairs to her bed. The next morning, she left New Horizons through the front door at 7. She walked 4 blocks east, turned into the parking lot of a Wendy's, and got into the sedan where Colt was waiting. She handed him the phone without a word. Colt scrolled through the photographs. 14 transfer forms, 14 names, 14 girls who had been moved to places that did not exist, signed out by a caseworker who worked at a shelter connected to a retired federal judge who had spent a decade making children disappear, and one phone number that appeared on every single form. Colt looked at her. Something moved behind his expression, something that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration, but existed in the space between the two. "You got it," he said. "I got it." 2 words. That was all she needed. The phone number belonged to a prepaid cell registered to a shell company called Meridian Consulting, LLC. Meridian Consulting had no employees, no office, no website, and no tax filings. What it did have was a registered agent, an attorney named Philip Dorn, whose office was located 6 blocks from the Duval County Courthouse. Philip Dorn had represented Judge Preston Mercer in a real estate transaction 4 years earlier. The connection was thin, but it was there. Gar took the evidence to the one place where institutional power could be met with institutional power, the FBI field office in Jacksonville. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Gar brought Colt and a criminal defense attorney the chapter had on retainer, a man named Wallace Pratt, who had been practicing law in Northeast Florida for 30 years, and who understood that the line between the legal world and the world outside it was thinner than most people wanted to believe. Pratt was the kind of attorney who wore suspenders and a pocket watch and read every document twice before speaking about it once. He had defended bikers, construction workers, bartenders, and at least one sitting county commissioner. He did not care what his clients looked like. He cared what the evidence looked like. And when he laid out the evidence on the conference table in the FBI's 7th floor conference room, the evidence looked very good. The photographs of the transfer forms, the names of the missing girls, the non-existent facilities, the phone number traced to Meridian Consulting LLC, the connection to Philip Dorn, the connection to Judge Preston Mercer, and beneath it all, anchoring everything, the testimony of an 18-year-old girl who had walked back into the system that had failed her and come out with the proof that nobody else had been able to find. The FBI agents listened without interruption. 2 men and 1 woman seated on the far side of the table, legal pads, open pens moving in small, precise strokes. They asked questions. They took notes. They did not react visibly because FBI agents are trained not to react visibly, but the questions they asked told Gar everything he needed to know. They asked about the guardrail, about the cut marks, about the truck with no plates, about the meeting at the clubhouse where 3 men in clean shoes had proposed a trafficking partnership and left a threat hanging in the air. They asked about Wren, how she had entered the shelter, how she had accessed the office, whether she had been coached, directed, or coerced by any member of the motorcycle club. Pratt answered those questions carefully, precisely, and truthfully. No, she had not been directed. She had volunteered. She had made the choice to go back in. The club had provided safety, not instruction. The agents exchanged a look, the kind of look that means a piece has fallen into place. They were not starting from zero. The federal investigation into Mercer had been building for months, assembled from fragments, from whistleblower tips that went nowhere, from patterns in foster care data that suggested something was wrong but couldn't prove what. A caseworker in Putnam County had filed a complaint about irregular transfers and then retracted it 2 weeks later. A state auditor had flagged discrepancies in placement records and then been reassigned to a different department. The pieces were there. The picture was forming. But the center was missing. Wren Calloway was the center. She was the witness who had been inside the machine, who had seen the gears turn. Who could describe from firsthand experience exactly how a retired federal judge had built a pipeline for making children disappear? The grand jury convened 6 weeks later. The indictment came down on a Thursday afternoon in late spring. Judge Preston Mercer was charged with 14 counts of human trafficking, 3 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of attempted murder. Dale Sykes was charged as a co-conspirator on all counts with additional charges of tampering with infrastructure resulting in bodily harm. Glenn, the caseworker from New Horizons, was charged with 14 counts of facilitating trafficking and falsifying government documents. The arrest of a retired federal judge is not a quiet event. It ripples outward through the legal community like a stone dropped into a pond. Attorneys who had argued cases before Mercer suddenly found themselves reviewing old rulings. Caseworkers who had processed his referrals began requesting transfers. News crews parked outside the Duval County Courthouse for 3 days straight, their cameras pointed at the same corridor where Mercer's photograph still hung on the wall, the plaque beneath it still reading honor and distinction. The photograph was removed on the second day. The plaque took longer. The trial began in September, 5 months after the indictment, in a federal courtroom in downtown Jacksonville. The gallery was full: reporters, attorneys, members of the public who had read the headlines and wanted to see for themselves. And in the third row on the left side, a group of men sat in silence. Not 38, not this time. 12. They wore clean shirts and pressed jeans. No cuts, no patches. Just 12 men who sat with the kind of stillness what communicates more than any uniform could. Gar was among them, arm no longer in a sling. The scar on his forehead had faded to a thin white line that caught the courtroom light when he turned his head. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes forward, and he did not speak. The prosecution built its case the way a mason builds a wall. One brick at a time: financial records, communication logs, testimony from former shelter staff who had been given immunity in exchange for their cooperation. The data was dense and technical and damning, a blueprint of a system that had been designed from the inside by a man who understood exactly how the system worked because he had spent 40 years operating it. Mercer's defense team was formidable. 3 attorneys from a firm in Tampa, the kind of firm that charges by the minute and wins by attrition. They challenged the chain of evidence. They questioned the reliability of witnesses. They argued that the transfer forms were administrative errors, not evidence of trafficking. They suggested that the investigation had been tainted by the involvement of a motorcycle club with a well-documented history of operating outside the law. The argument was not without teeth. The jury was attentive. The judge was careful. And for the first 3 days of testimony, the outcome felt genuinely uncertain. Then Wren took the stand. She walked from the gallery to the witness box without looking at Mercer. She did not look at the jury. She did not look at Gar. She walked the way she had once walked through the dark to the river's edge, with the focused, irreversible momentum of someone who has already made the decision and is now simply carrying it out. She sat down. She adjusted the microphone. She placed her hands flat on the wooden rail in front of her palms, down, scars up. It was not a conscious choice. It was simply where her hands went. But the scars were visible pink and raised under the courtroom lights, and every person in the gallery who looked at them understood without being told that those hands had a story. Her clothes were clean and simple. Dark pants, a white button-down shirt. Her hair was pulled back. Her mother's watch was on her left wrist, the second hand moving in its steady, quiet rhythm. The prosecutor began with the basics: her name, her age, her history, the foster care system, the group home in Orange Park, the shelter downtown where a man with clean fingernails had asked her questions that made the hair on her arm stand up. Wren answered each question in short, direct sentences. She did not elaborate. She did not emote. She did not perform grief or outrage or the kind of cinematic bravery that makes for good television. She described what had happened to her the way a mechanic describes what is wrong with an engine, with precision and without sentiment, trusting the facts to carry the weight that feelings could not. She described the night at the shelter, the questions Glenn had asked. How are you settling in? No family at all, the way his smile never reached his eyes. She described watching him select residents who matched a profile. Young, female, alone. She described Tessa, the girl in the next bed who had disappeared on the 6th day and been transferred to a facility that did not exist. She described the filing cabinet, the manila folder, the 14 transfer forms with the same phone number written on the back. She described photographing them at 2 in the morning with a phone sewn into the lining of her jacket, her hands steady, her breathing even, because she had spent 8 months learning how to be still in the dark. The courtroom was silent, not the silence of boredom or routine, but the silence of recognition, the silence that falls when a room full of people simultaneously understands that they are hearing something that matters. The defense attorney approached for cross-examination. He was tall, silver-haired, confident in the way that expensive attorneys are confident, a confidence built on preparation and precedent, and the assumption that every witness has a weakness. He started with her credibility. She had been homeless. She had used a false name at the shelter. She had entered the staff office without authorization. She had no formal training in investigation. She had been living with members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, a known outlaw organization at the time she conducted what she called her operation. Each point was delivered with precision. Each one was designed to erode trust, to reframe Wren as unreliable, as compromised as someone whose testimony could not be separated from the agenda of the people who had taken her in. Wren listened to all of it. She did not fidget. She did not look at Gar. She did not look at the jury. She looked at the attorney who was trying to take apart her credibility the way she had once taken apart a crushed car door, and she waited for him to finish. When he did, she spoke. "I used a false name because the real ones disappear." The attorney paused. "I entered that office because 14 girls had already gone through it and none of them came back." He opened his mouth to object. "And I lived under a bridge for 8 months before anyone offered me a roof. The people who offered it weren't the system. They were the ones your client tried to kill." The objection came, sustained. The judge instructed the jury to disregard. But the words were already in the room. They had landed where they needed to land. And the faces of the 12 jurors who had been listening with the careful neutrality that jury duty demands shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly enough for the court reporter to note, but enough. Enough for the prosecutor to see. Enough for Mercer's lead attorney to see. Enough for Mercer himself to see, though he continued to stare straight ahead, hands folded, expression locked in the same mask of composed authority he had worn for 4 decades. The mask was thinner now. You could see the edges. The prosecution rested on the 6th day. The defense rested on the 7th without calling Mercer to the stand. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. Guilty, all counts. The word moved through the courtroom like a current, not shouted, not whispered, simply spoken by the foreman, a man in his 60s with reading glasses and steady hands, who read each count in each verdict in the same measured voice, giving the same weight to count 1 as to count 17, because that was the job and the job required consistency. Preston Mercer was convicted of 14 counts of human trafficking, 3 counts of conspiracy, and 1 count of attempted murder. Dale Sykes was convicted on all co-conspirator charges with additional charges of tampering with infrastructure resulting in bodily harm. Glenn, the caseworker from New Horizons, had pleaded guilty 3 days before the verdict came in and agreed to cooperate in identifying additional victims and facilities connected to the network. The sentencing would come later. The numbers would be large. The kind of numbers that mean a man enters prison at 64 and does not leave it alive. But the numbers were not the point. The point was the moment itself. The moment when a system built on silence and invisibility was exposed to the one thing it could not survive: light. Mercer stood when the verdict was read. His expression did not change. His hands did not shake. He buttoned his suit jacket with the same precise, automatic gesture he had used 10,000 times before walking into a courtroom. It was the gesture of a man who had spent his entire career on the other side of that bench looking down deciding. Now the bench was above him, and the decision was not his, and the gesture meant nothing, but he performed it anyway because it was the last piece of control available to him. He allowed the marshals to lead him away without a word, and here the circle closed. Because this was the moment from the beginning of our story: the courtroom, the girl at the witness stand, the man in the $3,000 suit, the bailiff asking her to state her name. She had leaned toward the microphone and the screen had cut to black, and we had jumped back 6 months to a highway and a river and a car sinking in the dark. Now you know her name. Now you know what she did with Vet. The courtroom erupted behind Mercer, reporters, cameras, voices overlapping. But in the third row, 12 men in clean shirts sat in absolute silence. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They watched the man who had tried to kill their president, who had built a machine for making children disappear, walk through a door that would not open again for a very long time. Gar looked at Wren. She was still sitting in the witness box, though the judge had already excused her. Her hands were flat on the wooden rail. Her eyes were dry. She was staring at the door through which Mercer had disappeared, and something in her expression had changed. Not relief, not victory, something quieter than either. Something that looked like the end of a long exhale, the release of a breath she had been holding since the night her mother's hand went still in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and wilted flowers. She stood. She walked out of the courtroom. She did not look back. Outside, the afternoon sun hit her face and she stopped on the courthouse steps and closed her eyes and stood there for a long moment, feeling the warmth on her skin, listening to the traffic, listening to the world continue the way it always continues after something enormous has ended. Colt was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He didn't say anything. He handed her a helmet. They rode back to the shop. The weeks after the trial were quiet in the way that follows a storm. Not empty, just still. The pressure that had been building for months, the health inspections, the tax audits, the patrol car parked across the street evaporated overnight. The machinery of institutional harassment requires someone to operate it, and the operator was now behind bars. Wren went back to work at Boone's Custom. She arrived early. She stayed late. She didn't talk about the trial. She didn't talk about Mercer or Sykes or Glenn or the 14 forms in the manila folder. She talked about engines, about brake lines and timing belts and the particular sound a transmission makes when the synchronizers are worn and the driver doesn't know it yet. She was good at her work, better than good. She had the kind of focus that comes from understanding that skill is not a luxury, but an anchor, the thing that holds you in place when everything else tries to pull you loose. The brothers noticed. They always did. 6 months after the trial, on a Saturday evening in early winter, the chapter gathered at the clubhouse, not for business, not for a meeting. The tables were pushed back, food was laid out, the overhead lights had been replaced with something warmer, someone's idea of atmosphere, and it almost worked. Wren didn't understand at first why everyone was there. She thought it was just another dinner. She sat near the back, the way she still did near the edge, never assuming her place. Then Gar stood up. The room went quiet. Not the silence of authority, the silence of attention. The kind that comes when people know something is about to be said that they want to hear. A year ago, Gar said, "This young woman taught us something." Wren shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes dropped to the table. "She showed us that courage doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't check your credentials. It doesn't wait until conditions are favorable." He paused. She saw someone drowning and she went in. "That's it. That's the whole thing." He reached beneath the table and pulled out a jacket. Not a cut, something different. Leather clean and new with a single patch sewn onto the back. Honorary brother. The stitching was tight and precise, done by hand the way the chapter's patches had always been done. He held it out to her. Wren stared at it. She did not move. Her hands, the hands that had torn open a car door and photographed trafficking documents and gripped the witness stand rail while a courtroom watch trembled. She reached out and took it. She ran her fingers over the stitching. Then she pressed the jacket against her chest and held it there, and her eyes closed and her shoulders shook once, and that was all. That was enough. The room was quiet for a moment longer. Then someone in the back started clapping, and the sound spread, not loud, not raucous, just steady, the sound of recognition. Gar nodded toward the door. "One more thing." The door opened. The sound of an engine rolled inside, low and controlled. A motorcycle clean and chrome parked just outside the entrance. "This is yours." Wren looked at the bike, then at Gar, then at the bike again. She walked to it slowly. She touched the handlebars. She sat on the seat. She wrapped her hands around the grips, the leather warm beneath her scarred palms, and she sat there for a long time without starting the engine, just feeling the weight of it, the solidity, the fact that it was real and it was hers, and nobody was going to take it away. What most people didn't know, what Wren never announced, was what she did with her first real paycheck. She walked into a watchmaker's shop on San Marco Boulevard, a small place run by an old man with a loop permanently attached to his glasses, and she set her mother's watch on the counter. "Can you fix this?" The old man turned it over in his fingers. He opened the back. He looked at the movement inside the gears, frozen, the spring wound tight with nowhere to go. Battery's dead, crystal's cracked, but the movement is fine. He looked up at her. Good watch, someone took care of it. My mother, Ren said. He replaced the battery, he replaced the crystal, he cleaned the face and polished the case and handed it back to her, and when she strapped it on her wrist and heard the second hand begin to move ticking in a steady rhythm that she hadn't heard in over a year, she stood in the shop for a long time, listening to it, feeling the vibration against her skin, small and precise and alive. Time was moving again. With her second paycheck, she started something else. Not large, not public. A fund run through the shop that provided clothes tools and apprenticeship placement for homeless young people in Jacksonville. No name attached, no publicity, no gala dinners or press releases. Just a quiet pipeline that connected people who had nothing to a place where they could learn something, earn something, and become something other than invisible. She paid it forward. That was the phrase, though Ren never used it. She simply did what had been done for her. She opened a door for someone else and stood beside it until they walked through. 3 years passed. Ren Calloway was 21 years old. She was a certified mechanic. She ran the apprenticeship program at Boone's Custom, which now had a separate bay dedicated to training, with a whiteboard on the wall that listed the names of every young person who had come through the program and where they were working now. The list had 14 names. Ren added to it every few months. She lived in the same apartment near the shop. She rode her motorcycle to work every morning. She still wore her mother's watch, the second hand ticking in its steady, quiet rhythm, keeping time the way it was supposed to, the way it hadn't for over a year. She still didn't talk much. She still sat near the edges of group conversations. She still flinched sometimes when a door slammed too loud. But the flinch was almost gone now, and the edges were closer to the center than they had ever been. On a rainy evening in October, Ren was closing the shop when she heard it. Metal twisting, glass exploding, the scream of tires on wet pavement, a sound she had heard before, a sound that lived in her memory, the way certain sounds live in certain people, permanently, structurally woven into the architecture of who they are. She walked to the bay door and looked east toward the river. Flashing hazard lights, a shape in the road that was wrong. A car flipped, resting on its roof near the same stretch of highway where Gar's vehicle had gone into the water 3 years before. The river was high again. Rain had been falling for 2 days. Water crept across the road toward the overturned vehicle. People were stopping, pulling over, getting out of their cars, standing on the shoulder, reaching for their phones. Ren didn't reach for her phone. She ran. She crossed the parking lot, jumped the drainage ditch, and sprinted toward the wreck. The car was a sedan, silver, resting on its crushed roof, the wheels still spinning slowly. The windshield was shattered. Water from the swollen river was pooling around the vehicle, rising with the steady, patient indifference that rivers have for the things they intend to take. Inside, a family. A man in the driver's seat, conscious, bleeding from a cut above his ear, struggling with a seatbelt that wouldn't release. A woman in the passenger seat, unconscious, hanging upside down. And in the back seat, strapped into a car seat, a child, 3 years old, maybe 4, crying. Ren moved with a calm that surprised even her. She had been here before. Not at this wreck, not with this family, but in this moment, the moment where the water is rising and the metal is twisted, and everyone is standing on the shoulder, and nobody is moving forward. She dropped to her knees beside the driver's door. The window was gone, the glass scattered across the wet asphalt in 1,000 glittering pieces. She reached in and found the seatbelt release and pressed it, and the man dropped free. She helped him crawl through the window and onto the road. "My wife," he said. "My daughter." Ren was already moving to the passenger side. The door was jammed, but the window was broken. She reached in, found the woman's seatbelt, released it, and caught her weight as she fell. She pulled her through the window, carefully supporting her neck the way the paramedics had supported Gar's neck 3 years ago on the riverbank. Then the back seat. The child, still crying. The car seat harness was tangled, the buckle slippery with rain. Ren's hands worked fast and sure. The buckle released. She lifted the child through the window and held her against her chest and walked away from the car just as the river water reached the undercarriage and began to push the vehicle sideways. She carried the child to the shoulder of the road and set her down gently beside her father. She took off her own jacket and wrapped it around the woman who was starting to come around, blinking, confused, reaching for her daughter. Ren called 911 herself. She gave the location, the number of injured, the make and model of the car. She stayed on the line until she heard sirens. She did not leave. She stayed beside the family until the ambulance arrived. She held the child while the paramedics worked on the mother. She answered the police officers' questions clearly and completely. And when the father, sitting on the bumper of the ambulance with a bandage on his head and his daughter in his arms, looked up at her and asked her name, she answered, "Ren." He stared at her, rain running down his face, eyes red. "Thank you" doesn't cover it. She shook her head. "Someone did the same for me once." The story made the local news that night. The anchor called it a remarkable act of bravery by a young woman associated with a local motorcycle club. The camera caught Ren standing at the edge of the frame, muddy and wet, her hair plastered to her face, looking like she wasn't entirely sure she belonged in the shot. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, "Former homeless teen saves family from overturned car. Near St. John's River. Former homeless teen." As if that were the most important thing about her. As if the 8 months under bridges and in doorways were a title instead of a chapter that had ended. Gar watched from his living room. The television glow played across his face. The scar on his forehead caught the light the way it always did. A thin white reminder of a night 3 years ago when the river had tried to take him and a girl with nothing had said no. He didn't say much. He never did when it mattered. He just smiled and shook his head once. "That's my sister," he said. What the news didn't report, what the cameras didn't capture, was what had happened at the shop 2 weeks earlier. Gar had called Ren into his office on a Tuesday afternoon. He closed the door. He sat on the edge of the desk the way he always did when something mattered too much for the formality of a chair. He held out a key, not a house key, not a motorcycle key, a shop key. The master, the one that opened every bay door, every toolbox, every cabinet in the building. "I'm stepping back," he said. "The shop needs someone who will be here every day. Someone the kids trust. Someone who knows what it means to start with nothing." Ren looked at the key. She looked at Gar. She looked at the key again. "You're giving me the shop. I'm giving you what you earned." She took the key. She held it in her scarred palm and closed her fingers around it and felt the metal warm against her skin. The girl who had slept on concrete now held the key to the place that had given her a life. The girl who had been invisible now owned the room where 14 names were written on a whiteboard, each one a person who had been seen, who had been taught, who had been given the same chance she had been given on a night when the river tried to take something, and she said no. The next morning, Ren arrived at the shop before anyone else. She unlocked the bay doors. She turned on the compressor. She set her coffee on the workbench and pulled on her gloves and walked to the first car on the lift, a Honda Civic with a transmission leak, and began to work. On her wrist, her mother's watch ticked steadily, keeping time, keeping faith, a small mechanical heartbeat that said the same thing it had been saying since the day the watchmaker brought it back to life. Time moves forward. So do you. On the wall behind the workbench next to the whiteboard with the 14 names, someone had pinned a photograph. It showed the stretch of highway along the St. John's River, taken from the bridge looking down at the water. The guardrail had been replaced. The road had been repaved. There was no evidence that anything had ever happened there, but it had. A car had gone into that river on a dark night in Florida. A girl had gone in after it. And everything that followed the search, the shelter, the filing cabinet, the courtroom, the verdict, the jacket, the motorcycle, the 14 names on the whiteboard, the child pulled from a car seat on a rainy October night. All of it, every piece had started with a single choice made in the dark by someone the world had decided didn't matter. The river had tried to take a life. Instead, it gave two people exactly what they needed. Gar got a second chance. Ren got a family, a retired judge got a cell, 14 girls got their names back. And a city learned that sometimes the people standing in the shadows are the ones holding everything together. Ren pulled on her gloves. She picked up a wrench. She walked to the Honda Civic on the lift and bent beneath it and began to work. Outside, the sun came up over the St. John's River. The water moved on, indifferent and eternal, carrying no memory of what it had tried to take and no knowledge of what it had given. But the girl remembered. The girl with the scarred hands and the borrowed jacket and the mother's watch ticking on her wrist remembered everything. And every morning when she opened the shop and turned on the lights and wrote a new name on the whiteboard, she proved something that the river had known before anyone else. Courage doesn't need a home. It doesn't need a name. It doesn't need permission or a title or a seat at someone else's table. It just needs a heart that refuses to walk away. Wren Calloway had that heart. She had always had it. The river knew it first.